Greenhouse gas emissions and global warming are among humanity's most pressing concerns.
Almost more than anything, one little number matters.
Carbon dioxide, having never gone above 300 parts per million, here is where CO2 is now.
First world civilization as we know it is going to decline or collapse within the next several decades.
While there's some uncertainty about how much of a problem 2 degrees of additional warming will be and how we'll be able to adapt to it, scientists say we'll likely see longer droughts and more intense heat waves, which could cause big disruptions to the world's food supply. At 2 degrees, sea levels could rise several feet, which would flood many coastal communities in the US and potentially cause large migrations of people from countries like Bangladesh and India and Vietnam.
Many of the most advanced societies of the past ended up in ruins, although at the height of the Roman Empire or the height of Maya civilization, it would have seemed equally absurd that those great societies could ever collapse. Well, they did, and we could. It's a matter of life or death for us to understand why these past societies succeeded or failed.
By collapse, I mean a drastic decrease in human population size and or political, economic, social complexity over a considerable area for an extended time. By those standards, most people would consider the following past societies to have been famous victims of full-fledged collapses rather than of just minor declines. The Anasazi and Cahokia within the boundaries of the modern U.S., the Maya cities in Central America, Moche and Tiwanaku societies in South America, Mycenaean Greece and Minoan Crete in Europe, Great Zimbabwe in Africa, Angkor Wat and the Harappan Indus Valley cities in Asia, and Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean.
Of all, Easter Island. It's a tiny little island that's also known as Rapa Nui in the local language, that's in the middle of the Pacific. It's 3,500 kilometers from the mainland of Chile, 2,000 kilometers from any other Polynesian island. It's really a small island in the middle of nowhere. But yet on this teeny tiny island, we find some of the most spectacular cases of prehistoric monument construction anywhere in the world. And this archaeology is pretty famous. The statues that are made there are known as moai. And these statues range from a couple meters to nearly 10 meters in height. They weigh up to 70 tons of stone, and they're put on top of massive platforms known as ahu. Well, a lot of people know about Easter Island because of the monuments and the story that's sort of grown up around that. And that's been made very famous and popular by Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, and this failure that drives this collapse story. Moai mania causes a downward spiral of cultural regression, in the words of some authors. There really is no evidence whatsoever to support a prehistoric demographic collapse on Rapa Nui. In the 18th century, European contact resulted in catastrophic demographic loss. And it's really well documented. We have lots of historic records. The environment of Rapa Nui was never particularly great. That the soils themselves are actually very depleted, have very low nutrients, sort of naturally, because they're very weathered soils. So the result was that the resources that people needed to survive on were never that particularly fantastic. People had to live in a very ingenious way. So what we said, instead of a rich environment that gets destroyed, instead we see people taking a once treed environment and turning it into a garden landscape that allowed them to grow resources that enabled them to survive. And we see a tale of 500 years of persistence of people on a remote and tiny island in the middle of the Pacific with very limited resources.
This is America's Great Southwest, a vast landscape with a long history of peoples who've inhabited its canyons and plateaus.
My name's Ryan Harrod, and I'm a bioarchaeologist interested in understanding the American Southwest and its reactions to climate change. Researchers have been fascinated by the American Southwest for over a century, some of the earliest archaeology in the U.S. being done there.
Dendrochronology, the study of the tree rings in the timber used to construct the buildings at Chaco. They provided a startling revelation. About 1,000 years ago, the weather changed. An era of record rains began.
The increased rainfall led to greater crop yield. The greater crop yield led to more complexity. More complexity is seen in the development of a regional system, which is evident at the sites like Pueblo Bonito. According to recent research by Willis and colleagues, people didn't leave Chaco Canyon because of a drought. They started declining their building and moving out of the canyon prior to any known climate change event. And later, people moved back to the canyon, establishing a new type of architecture.
There are those who believe that the demise of Chaco was inevitable, that the city was just a stop on a long historical journey which their gods had mapped out for them, and that Chaco was not meant to last forever.
So back to the question of where did the people of Chaco Canyon go? Looking at DNA, oral traditions, we know that they stayed in the American Southwest, and they're tied to people still living there today.
According to a new study out by NASA and soon to be published, modern civilization is heading for collapse within a matter of decades. Scientists took a look at a human nature dynamics of past cases of collapse using indicators like population, climate, water, agriculture, and energy.
Like the other great ancient civilizations in Iraq, Egypt, and China, India's first cities had grown up on a river. The ruins of Harappa stood on the dried-up bed of a tributary of the river Indus. Its huge citadel walls had been quarried away by Victorian railway contractors. But there was still evidence of industry and trade, of writing and high-level organization, and a huge population.
My name is Gwen Robin Shug, and I'm a bioarchaeologist. For bioarchaeologists, human skeletal material and human burials are the most direct forms of evidence about past people's lives. The techniques we use are very similar to those used in forensics. We look for traces of behavior, traumatic injuries, and diseases on the bones themselves, and we can also use what we know about chemistry in bones and teeth as a source of evidence about things like climate change, migration, and diet in the past. For the Indus civilization, climate change was initially associated with population growth, not collapse. I looked at human skeletons from the Indus city of Harappa to address questions about the experience of collapse at one of the largest Indus cities. In general, the urban population at Harappa had a low prevalence of skeletal stress markers, and there were a couple of individuals who had evidence for cranial trauma, which could represent interpersonal violence, but it was at a very low prevalence in the urban population. Interestingly, we did find some evidence that new infectious diseases may have entered South Asia at this time as well, perhaps along those trade routes that brought people to the Indus cities in the first place. But as the city grew, so did social inequality. The trade routes that Indus people were participating in became disrupted, and so after 200 years of climate change and in the face of population growth and rising social inequality, Indus cities were basically abandoned. A small population remained in the city of Harappa until 1300 BC. A number of these individuals also demonstrated signs of infectious diseases like leprosy. And a large number of individuals suffered from traumatic injuries resulting from an increase in interpersonal violence at this time. Leprosy has clear impacts on human health. Untreated, it is highly disfiguring, and people with leprosy in South Asia today face significant social stigma. An examination of mortuary behavior at the Indus city of Harappa and of texts that were composed around the same period of time suggests that the othering process for people with leprosy began during this moment of crisis. In the present, as in the past, a large number of historical, political, economic, ideological, and other factors shape the long-term outcomes of our short-term strategies. When there's a popular conception of catastrophic changes looming, and a crisis brings with it a sense that a way of life is ending, this kind of rupture opens a space for cultural change. Unfortunately, when Jared Diamond and others tell us that collapse is an event, it creates a false sense of security. Publics can be easily pacified by the fact that the sun still rises and that their world did not end in a day. But collapse is not an event. History has seen many catastrophes unfold over time. Collapse is a process. At a local level in time, people think things are fine. Then things rapidly spiral out of control until they become unstoppable, and we wreak massive destruction on ourselves. For people living in the midst of this, it's hard to see it happening, and it's hard to understand. To historians later, it all makes sense, and we see clearly how one thing led to another. If we're to learn anything about the character of resilience from the way it's been inscribed on the human skeleton in past cases of collapse, it's that in the context of urban societies operating through social inequality, moments of crisis can create conditions painful enough that some people will choose to walk away. And for those that remain, resilience becomes an experience of extreme suffering.